Let me explain. If you look at the defense agreement that you've signed, you are now essentially hostage as a nation to whatever the United States does or does not do against almost any enemy anywhere, not just Russia, but potentially any adversary. If you read carefully, we have unobstructed access to all 17 bases. There's nothing in there that prevents us from bringing in nuclear weapons or any other advanced weapon system that we may develop in the meantime. This means that Sweden can be used as a launching pad for attack against Russia, or again against anyone that the United States ends up in conflict with. This is not just a purely regional agreement that prefaces, or at least is predicated on the notion that you are attacked and then we come and help. The idea is that you now have a state of readiness in the United States Armed Forces that will be placed in your country that is ready to pull the trigger and go to war essentially without much consultation, if any, against Russia. I would think this is a very dangerous document. If I were Swedish, I would not support it.
And so what you're saying is technically that if the Americans would enter a war with, say, Russia, and they would be sort of the aggressor, or they would do anything that means that the Article 5 of NATO is not fulfilled, that Sweden could technically still be used as an advanced area or a base from where military strikes could be conducted against the enemy, even if we technically are not part as a nation in this conflict.
Yes, as I said before, the model for these agreements was really, or were really, the treaties that we reached with Germany and Japan, who had lost a major war, had little ground to stand on, and essentially signed pretty much whatever we put in front of them. I don't understand why Sweden or Finland or Norway or anybody else would want to do such a thing. There are all sorts of scenarios that could lead to conflict. You know, incidents inside the Arctic Circle, competition, conflict over access to resources, and then events that happen perhaps in the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, or even in the Pacific that lead to a confrontation between the United States and Russia or China or someone else, and suddenly your bases are being used as a point of delivery for weapons of some kind, missiles, tactical ballistic missiles, theater ballistic missiles, and so forth. You know, I don't understand it because I don't see an existential threat from Russia to Sweden. I think this is a huge lie. It's unnecessary. And if the Russians were genuinely interested in going to war with the West, they would already be sitting on the Polish border right now. And they're not, nor do they want a war with the West. That's something they don't even want to consider undertaking. They really want to get back to some sort of state of normalcy. They simply want Ukraine to be neutral. They don't want a state on their border that is armed to the teeth with weapons pointed at them. Sadly, we've tried to proliferate that problem. In other words, we are interested in provoking Russia, literally from Finland all the way to Armenia. This is catastrophically stupid and unnecessary, and that's something that the Swedes need to think about. I certainly would hope that your parliament would debate this matter very thoroughly before they effectively sign on for it. But I don't know what your law requires of Sweden. I'm simply saying that, you know, your sovereignty is very much at risk. You think you have problems with the European Union, they shrink to almost insignificance to the problems that a treaty like this creates for you. And I don't understand this extreme sensitivity to what's happening in Russia. It looks like the lie machine, the fiction machine, has worked very effectively to convince everybody that Putin simply woke up one day and decided to invade Ukraine, which is nonsense. We provoked him for years. Some people go back to 2008, to Bucharest, to the initial announcement by NATO that eventually Ukraine would join NATO. Well, I suppose so. I think you go back even further, but the point is you then get subsequently this coup in 2014, orchestrated, executed by the CIA, and the next thing you know, we are building Ukraine up into a significant military power, which is what we've done, pouring billions and billions of dollars into them for equipment, training, organization, and so forth. And now we've invested probably $100+ billion maybe 150 billion or more, in an attempt to effectively take on and destroy Russia. What's really amazing about events right now is that the Russians have exercised such tremendous restraint. I'm surprised that we've avoided war to this point with Russia. You know, Sweden's very attractive in many ways because you have these vast forests, areas where operations and exercises can be held. And that's appealing because it's become increasingly difficult in Central Europe, which is highly populated and increasingly urbanized, to conduct those maneuvers and operations. That's another reason why the US military looked very favorably on Poland, because as you go east in Poland, you have open rolling terrain, hills, forests, and so forth. And these can accommodate large exercises and maneuvers. The question is, how much of this do you want? How often do you want it? And what are the implications for Sweden and its existence as a state, its sovereignty, if you simply sign off, as apparently somebody has? I presume it was your defense minister. You know, I can't answer all of those questions, but I'm trying to at least indicate to you that if I were in your position, I would raise serious questions. And that's not because I'm disloyal to my country. I love my country. I simply see no benefit in the current age for us to have large numbers of forces overseas on other people's soil. I certainly see no benefit to putting nuclear weapons in close proximity to Russia. We live in a world today where nuclear weapons can be delivered from the sea, from the air, from any number of different places at great distance from where you are. The notion that we should put a nuclear weapon in Finland or Sweden makes no sense to me at all. And I think if General Eisenhower were here, who was president in the 1950s, he would say, this is ridiculous. What do we do if the nuclear weapons are overrun by the opponent? So he was a staunch opponent of the idea of putting lots of nuclear weapons in Europe, period. He thought in terms of either at sea or perhaps someplace in North Africa, you know, on the periphery of Europe, but not in Europe itself. Now, we made exceptions to that rule because we felt that we had no choice because we could not match Soviet conventional military power. Well, I think the concern now is that we will not be able to match Russian conventional military power either. Now, that presupposes that the Russians have any interest in marching over Finland and into Sweden. I see none. But, you know, these are military considerations that you have to confront.
And it's very interesting that you touch upon the topic of nuclear weapons. The biggest fear among the Swedish public and also by the critical politicians is the risk that we will have nuclear weapons stored at these military bases. What are the risks that the Americans will transport nuclear weapons and have them stationed here at the military bases, considering that we don't have any clause against it? It doesn't mention nuclear weapons in this agreement. They say it is not necessary. The Americans have not requested it. But what are the risks that the Americans will still do it? And since
you and I do not know what sort of secret agreements have been reached that are not public, that are attachments to the current treaty that has been signed or agreement that has been signed. So we don't know. But if you're going to open the numbers of bases that you mentioned, and you're going to allow our ships into your waters, and you're going to allow our aircraft to land and take off from air bases, you effectively have surrendered control over what comes in and goes out. You have no way of knowing if nuclear weapons are brought in, are suddenly, you know, warheads are suddenly mounted on missiles that previously had conventional warheads. And then an announcement is made that Sweden and Finland, for instance, have these weapons that are aimed at Russia because someone decides that it's necessary to intimidate Russia, which I think is pure folly and stupidity. But I'm just, you know, I'm giving you a theoretical situation. And there you sit, the Swedish government has no effective control whatsoever. I mean, we do still have some nuclear warheads on the ground in Turkey. And I know that there are a lot of people concerned about that, both in the United States and Turkey. The point is that we live in a different world now. We are in the age of hypersonic missiles. We don't need to have weapons that are weapons of mass destruction in close proximity to any potential opponent. We can simply change the targeting, and we can launch weapons from sea, from the continental United States, from the air. But I would, as a Swede, I would want to look into that. I would want to know what is not public and find out what's in it. And again, I would debate this thing immediately in the open and really question the rationale for it. I mean, how many armies or Russian navies or air forces are sitting on your border poised to invade or strike you? I don't think there are any. On the other hand, if you're sitting in Moscow and you watch what we are doing with these agreements, then you may reconsider and decide, well, it looks as though we're going to have to target Finland and Sweden and Norway after all. If you're Russian, we didn't plan on it. We don't want to do that. But if they're going to maintain this hostile posture towards us, then we have no choice. Again, I think it's time to think through all of this. This is not 1900. It's not 1950. It's 2024. Technology has raced ahead faster than we can absorb it, understand it, grasp it. It's time to think differently about warfare in general and the utility of these agreements. I really do. I think it has to be re-examined. I hope you will do that.
Could this agreement and as well as the very aggressive and rapid expansion of NATO, especially in Northern Europe, be interpreted as a preparations for a major military conflict with Russia in Northern Europe or in Europe as a total?
Well, I think so. I think there are foolish people that think in those terms. But I would point out something. First of all, I personally don't think the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is going to survive. As it becomes increasingly clear that Russia has become once again, at least one of the top 5, top 4 military powers in the world, and that NATO has failed miserably to stop, deter, halt, obstruct Russia's operations in Ukraine, people will begin to question the wisdom of joining an alliance that is so incompetent and ineffective. I think that's going to come out in the months and years ahead. I've often said that sacred cows are never slain, they simply vanish. I think NATO is a sacred cow that over the next few years will simply vanish. Nobody will talk about it anymore. And quite frankly, the problem with NATO is it's got, 32 members now? And everyone does unavoidably see the world differently. If you think anyone in France, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Albania, Croatia, Slovenia, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, no one in these countries is interested in going to war in Ukraine. It's not going to happen. Do you really believe under any circumstances that any of them would come to your aid if you were in a war? Of course not. So what is this all about? This is a last-ditch effort by this ruling class to do two things. First of all, maintain conditions of conflict and hostility towards Russia, which they deem as indispensable to their continued political dominance. And then secondly, they are subjugating you to their will. All of these people in Stockholm, Brussels, London, Washington, Paris, Berlin, they are all united in a purpose to reshape Europe according to their views, their values, their principles. And I think most Europeans have figured out that they don't necessarily subscribe to these values. Swedes actually like Sweden. They want it to stay Swedish. The same thing is true in Norway, England, Scotland, Wales, but the governments don't care about that. Refashioning you into an amorphous mass of sedated consumers with no real national identity or purpose seems to be the end state, the goal. And hostility to Russia, which is fiercely nationalistic, which is determined to preserve its existence, its religion, its culture, its language, is obviously anathema to them. So what side do you really want to be on? You ought to be on Sweden's side. And where do Sweden's interests lie? Do they lie with this, in my view, self-destructive alliance, or do they lie elsewhere? So that's a question you've got to answer.